Hey guys, welcome to another video. Today I am going to be showing you step by step how to create this portrait with gouache. I find it best when I start with the background first, and in order to do the background and cover as much space as possible without using too much paint, because we all know how gouache tends to be a little bit expensive, I like to water down my gouache as much as possible because in the end, I'm going to be adding clouds, I'm going to be adding details to it. There's really no need to apply a thick layer in the first layer. Now in this layer, when I'm doing the clouds, I do like to apply a thick layer and then I like to spread it with water just to diffuse the clouds so they aren't too cartoon-like and they are a little bit more realistic. I also like to place the brush a little bit to an angle rather than straight ahead onto the paper. It just makes for an easier, more natural looking cloud. As the gouache dries, I will be going over the clouds over again because gouache tends to dry a little bit darker, so the highlights tend to dull down. If there are sections where I do know that I want a thick layer, I know the color that I want, and I know that I want it to be very opaque, I do go ahead and apply a thick layer to that. However, as you'll see, I use water to just kind of water it down a little bit and a little bit of white to mix into that original color, and it just gives it a little bit of a gradient effect. Now, I'm not trying to go completely gradient in this part of the painting because really, like you see here, I add details to it and it just makes it a little bit more visually interesting. So not everything needs to be gradiated to perfection. When I'm starting with the face, I like to apply layers that are very thin, watered down of gouache. I just like to get a little bit of a feel of what are the colors that I'm going to be using. Now here's the thing, I always find that I'm constantly layering over and over with the face because I'm trying to create different color hues and just trying to make it a little bit more visually interesting rather than just make it a little bit more realistic. So you'll see me playing with colors and going back and forth. Some colors I do use a thick layer and some colors I use a thin layer. For the lights, I use usually a thin layer. For these colors that are like these blues, because I want them to stand out a lot and because I'm going to go over them in the second layer and I want to mix in those colors together, I use a thicker layer. The thicker the layer is, the easier it's going to be to blend your gouache. The way you want to blend your gouache is to make sure that the layers are thick enough where you're rubbing gently the brush towards the paper without rubbing it all the way down to the paper. That way you can blend it without having those streaks. You might be thinking there's no point in applying certain layers and then going over it with a different color, but there is actually. When you add a different color on top, the color that you get is different from adding a straight color onto it. So if you add blue and then you put a little bit of red over on the second layer, it's gonna turn into a tint of a purplish or more like a purplish toned type of look rather than adding red on the first layer and then adding red again. Then it will just be red. Of course, this does add vibrancy, so there are times where you do want to layer in the same colors over and over just to give it that pop and that vibrancy. But because I'm focused more on the blendability and the effects of having different colors versus the vibrant pops, I just go ahead and I use different colors and different layers and just add on to each layer with a different color to give it a more interesting hue. I enjoy a lot of portraits that have a lot of vibrancy and color to it. Portraits such as like Black Bean CMS portraits and his particularly his oil pastel pieces. They're very nice to look at, and I kind of got the inspiration to add blues, even light blues, as shadows rather than adding a dark color to it. It just makes it a little bit more pop. It adds a little bit more of a rainbow of colors. It makes the piece a little bit more interesting and vibrant rather than just it looking a little bit too realistic, which would be a little bit too much for my personal taste. Now, in reference to the layers, usually my first layer tends to be a little bit more based on realistic colors that you would find in the skin. Then on my second layer, I like to add a little bit of pops of different colors that may not necessarily be as natural. On the third layer, sometimes I like to just blend in a little bit. So I add, in different places, I'll add either a natural looking color or a color that's more vibrant and unnatural, quote unquote. And I use that to blend into each other so it creates harmony rather than strokes or lines, because that's just personally not my style. But you can do more strokes, lines, and less blending if you like to. If that's your style, then that's perfectly fine too. I also use my second and third layers to add colors that are like shadows and highlights. Now, towards the end, of course, I add many layers, and the reason why I add many layers is because I'm just working through the colors that I want. It's not necessarily needed to add that many layers. It's just simply me not knowing exactly the colors that I want and playing around and trying to get the colors that I want. Also, you'll realize that because gouache is a water-based product, if you don't use a lot of gouache versus the water, you'll see that as the gouache dries, it dries a more toned down, and you'll have to go over it a couple times in order to get that vibrancy. Like I'm showing you here in the forehead and stuff where I'm going over it. It usually dries a little bit darker, so I do have to go over it sometimes, and that is in itself a reason why I add a lot of layers. I have to go over it sometimes in order to bring that brightness up again. Now, I have to admit, this was a different moment. When I'm doing this painting, I did take a break, and at this point I wasn't really sure what I was doing. I was just painting for the sake of painting. It worked out in the end, as it usually does in the end, but I don't really have a lot to say as far as the technique here in this certain aspect or this certain time in the painting process, because it was just me trying to work things out and just do a little bit of details here and there, and of course blend a little bit more. For shadows, I like to use light blues, which essentially are like ultramarines, cobalt, or even Prussian blue mixed in with whites to create a lighter toned blue. And as far as the highlights, I like to use Naples yellow or mix in yellow with a little bit of white, actually white with a little bit of yellow, to give it that effect. When it comes together, the shadows and the highlights complement each other when I'm using colors like that versus using more natural colors, or if I were to use plain white as a highlight. It sounds reasonable in your mind to create white or to paint white as a highlight, but really what it does is it dulls down the painting and it kind of gives it a not as vibrant or appealing to look at, if that makes sense. Adding a white that has a tint of something else really complements a painting and really makes it stand out. When I'm doing larger pieces like this, where I'm doing the hair and the hair takes up a large piece, I try to just focus on just applying color in the first layers. And even if they don't necessarily match, it's okay. I will blend them together anyways, and I'll just work on it. The hair that I do, or the style that I do for hair, is not natural by any means. I don't think it looks natural. And I'm totally fine with it not looking natural, because in the end, that's not necessarily the overall goal that I have in mind. I do like to use this blue, which is a ultramarine or cobalt blue mixed with white, to give it this vibrant light blue shadows in the hair, and just give it like streaks and stuff. This is supposed to be like shadows. And you will see also that around the head, and this is all just a personal taste, a personal style that I want to accomplish. Around the head, I'm going to use an even lighter version of that blue, adding a little bit more white, just to give it this aura or glow around the character itself. Now, if you've ever thought that you can't use watercolor over gouache, you are mistaken, ma'am or sir, because you can use it. Right now I'm using Arteza Metallic palette that I purchased a couple weeks ago. And the key to using watercolor over gouache is that it needs to be used with a very light stroke, one stroke. Because watercolor does tend to have a lot of water as a ratio, it can water down and it can move your gouache. So you need to be very decided on how you apply the watercolor. You simply cannot test it too much because it will move the gouache. I find that gouache is actually a lot easier to pick up and move than watercolor is. So you do have to be very careful with that. But here I'm using it to emphasize drops of rain coming down. And I just wanted to give the painting this effect. When you turn the paper around, you will see how the iridescent watercolor pieces change and move as you move them around. I find that very cool. Yeah. There's a stark piece right here at the bottom of white, in which I didn't really know what to do, so I just painted it blue and just let the viewer assume that it is a shirt, and you'll see that later on in the video. But yeah, sometimes there's certain things that just are not as important to me, and I kind of just emphasize and improvise in that painting. And I also was just really excited for this painting to be done because I was really happy with the way that it turned out. And I didn't really see a point in going over too much with the shirt issues. I thought it was fine. So yeah, guys, this is the finished painting. This is It's Raining Again. That's the title that I put for this painting. If you are interested in any of the paintings that I create, I do post them up for sale on my website at lilianperez.com. You can also check out my website for newsletters and blogs. I do plan on doing some courses in the future, but for now I'm just working on growing my YouTube channel and just, posting and putting the artwork that I have on my website, not WhatsApp. So yeah, if you want to check that out, that's also available for you to look at, and that is at lillianperezart.com. Also, I'll put it at the end of the video right now. Keep painting. Bye.